Hello and welcome to the video. With the rise of trade blocs like the EU and groups such as the World Trade Organization, free trade has become more and more widespread. But recently some large economies have moved in a different direction. So with Britain leaving the EU and America fighting a trade war, we ask, what's so good about free trade? At the heart of it, free trade is simply an extension of free market economics. If a free market is the most efficient way of allocating resources within a country, then maybe it's the best way to allocate resources between countries. Economists often model the idea of comparative advantage to explain why two countries can benefit from trading freely. First introduced by David Ricardo in 1817, it is the idea that some countries have a margin of superiority in the supply of some products. For example, producing exotic fruits in Norway is expensive because of the climate. It doesn't make sense for Norway to divert resources to producing fruit when people's land, labour and capital could be put to better use producing oil or aluminium. Norway can specialise in oil production and then trade with a country like New Zealand who export a lot of fruit and other food products. This is a more efficient way of allocating resources, and both countries are made better off if they specialise and then trade with each other. When countries specialise, they can take advantage of economies of scale, and when countries trade, they will increase competition in the market, and this results in more choice for consumers and lower prices. But this isn't all good. If you import most of your food, then you're dependent on other countries selling you their food. That makes you vulnerable if there are problems with other economies, such as recessions, natural disasters, or even wars. The same goes with importing most of your energy sources, like oil. It's completely out of your control, and you become dependent on another country. What's more, if your country specialises in only a few products, then if global demand for these products slumps, your economy would be vulnerable to this type of shock as well. In addition, free trade can stop countries developing new industries. This is a particular problem for developing countries who don't have big industries because of the competition from more developed nations. But with less free trade, they could grow industries enough to compete on an international level. So it can make sense to protect infant industries, at least until they develop a comparative advantage, with tariffs on imports or non-tariff barriers like quotas and regulations. This will help diversify your economy and make it less vulnerable to external shocks. Another issue with free trade is dumping. Countries can sell excess stock to the global market below cost. It is alleged that China has done this with excess supply of steel, which can cause a short-term shock to steel firms in other countries and put them out of business. Only, when the dumping stops, steel prices then rise again. So in this case, it may be worth applying tariffs or other trade barriers to stop dumping from having any effect. And to add to all this, free trade can sometimes lead to a so-called race to the bottom, where countries rapidly strip back regulations on standards and labour protection laws in an effort to give themselves a comparative advantage over other countries, which restrict trade with countries with lower standards. By now you may be thinking that free trade is much too problematic, and that protectionism is the way forward. But as is so often the case in economics, there may be an optimised middle ground. The European Union has one way of managing all this. You could view the EU as a champion of free trade, since for its member countries there is almost frictionless trade, not only for goods, but also for services with free movement of people between members. Some members even share the same currency, making trade even easier than ever before. But they have structures in place that prevent many of the problems we've been talking about. The race to the bottom on regulation isn't an issue because they share many regulations, with each member represented in the European Parliament and accountable to the European courts if they break the regulations. And being dependent on each other isn't as much of a problem, with various structures in place like the European Central Bank to oversee monetary policy and the European Council to help coordinate fiscal policy responses, which means when problems do arise, they have ways of dealing with them. For example, for the current crisis, the EU is able to bulk buy medical equipment like ventilators and PPE. On the other hand, the European Union can be seen as extremely protectionist. Take agriculture as an example. The EU not only imposes tariffs on many agricultural imports from non-member states, but also subsidises its own agricultural industry to protect it from global competition, a policy which harms developing countries trying to export into the EU. In addition, the EU has a number of non-tariff barriers, such as strict standards and regulations which prevent, for example, the US exporting chlorinated chicken into the EU. In this way, it could be said that the EU is able to get the most out of free trade between its members, but still protecting its industries from external shocks and global competition. Ultimately, free trade can bring about great prosperity by providing more choice for consumers and lower prices, but it requires countries being dependent on each other, and whatever the benefits for their citizens, independence is not something countries forego easily. Hello there, my name is Ollie. I present all the videos for Economics Unlocked. If you want more content from us, then you can check out our website and our Instagram page, and I'll link those down below in the description. But otherwise, thank you very much for watching. Have a wonderful day.